Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. Your hosts this morning are Christoph Barnett, Neville Hicks and myself, Simon Caudry. Good morning, gents.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Today's show is dedicated to discussing the recently introduced pension legislation. There have been a number of changes that have been introduced, some of them slightly controversial, some of them welcome, some of them not by some members of the community. And so we'll be delighted this morning to be joined by two people, the Honourable Tara Rivers, who is the Minister of Education, Employment and Gender Affairs. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning.
And also by Ms Amy Wollaston, who is the Superintendent of Pensions and Deputy Director of Pensions.
Good morning.
Good morning to you as well. Thank you both for joining us. Obviously, there have been some changes that have been introduced by law as of the beginning of this year. Perhaps you could just help us understand exactly what those changes are then.
Well, there are a number of changes, the 5 key ones that I think people need to be aware of right now that will affect what happens in the pension regime right now, and then over the course of the several months and when regulations come into force as well, there will be additional changes that come into force. But I'll ask Amy to take us through what those key changes are at this stage.
So on the 1st of January, so this has already happened, given our date
this
today.
Year, yeah.
Yes, of this year, thank you. On the 1st of January, the normal age of pension entitlement, which basically means the age when you are able to access, increased from 60, which it is under the 2012 version of the law, to 65 under the amendment. In addition, we've also increased the year's maximum pensionable earnings. All that is the amount on which you need to pay pension contributions. And that was $60,000 and is now increased to $87,000. So instead of paying 10% on $60,000, you're paying 10% on $87,000. Those have already come into effect. Some key things that are coming into effect include on the 1st of February, collaboration between our office and other government departments that helps with issues of compliance. Also, some key changes for employers. On March 1st, the definition of employee actually changes so that Caymanians who are under the age of 23 and in full-time education are no longer required to pay pension contributions, neither the employee nor the employer. Also, another critical change on the 1st of March is the requirement for employers to maintain records, which is something most employers probably already do, but the law didn't actually dictate or stipulate what those records needed to be. So we've actually included that in the amendments to the law this time, and those records need to be kept for 5 years. So I think all of those are very important in order for people to understand those things are coming into effect. Something that comes into effect a little later is access to additional voluntary contributions. That comes into effect in March of this year, at the end of March actually, and under the law, presently, you can't access your additional voluntary contributions, commonly known as AVCs, until a person reaches retirement age. But in the amendment, which comes into effect on the 31st of March, you'll be able to access your AVCs prior to retirement under 4 very specific categories: housing, medical purposes, temporary unemployment, and educational. So those are some key things that are changing.
Okay. Well, let's go back a step and let's just look at what has been changed as of today. We're in January, and it's happened as of the 1st of January. 2 that you mentioned there, the increase in the pensionable age from 60 to 65 and the increase in the maximum pensionable amount that has to be paid by employers from $60,000 to $80,000. Perhaps you could just talk to us philosophically about why those changes were made, because people look at that and say, well, it's important to understand why those changes are made in order to actually have a debate about whether it's the sensibility of those. Perhaps you could just help us out in the philosophy of it. Pardon me.
Sure. The fact is, Simon, we're living longer. The statistics show that. The data show that. We therefore need to make plans for longer life expectancy. And so many of us not just have the need, but also the desire to continue to work longer, to be able to put money aside for when you want to enjoy your golden years, so to speak. And we know those golden years are increasing. I think the average life expectancy is 83 years old in the Cayman Islands, which is actually above the kind of global average. So having the what was deemed to be in the law at the time, the retirement age at 60, was kind of out of step with where the world was going as it relates to age of pension entitlement. So there is a definitional change as well, which is important because it makes it clear that there is no mandatory retirement age in the country, but instead it is elective process if persons decide, well, you know what, I have worked to 65 and I would now like to, no longer stay in the active labour force. At age 65 is what the age that we've raised that age to, given the fact that people, as I said, on average are living longer and need to make provisions longer. So by raising the age, you increase the number of years that people actually save towards their retirement, and you actually allow persons to stay and contribute in the labour force as well, because of the previous law in many instances were used in ways to actually have people exit the workforce prior to even maybe.
Let me ask you about that in some more detail, because I want to try and understand the mechanics of that. If someone under the previous law was approaching the age of 60 and they turned 60, was it the case that they might actually be forced to leave their job because they had reached the age 60? Whereas now, as with the change in the wording of the law, it simply says that's the age you're entitled to now receive your pension. You can't receive it before, but you can continue working until you're 70 or 75 if you want to, if you and the employer both agree. Is that the subtlety of the change that you're talking about?
Correct. The commencement order, as it relates to the age of pension entitlement, takes into account another subtlety, and it's important to raise that too, because people that may have been approaching the age of 60, say anyone that is 48 and above, by 1st of January 2017, still has the option to have the early retirement at 50 and age of pension entitlement at 60, which is under the 2011 revision, because of the fact that we don't want to disenfranchise those persons who might have been thinking about retirement and putting things in place, either early retirement or regular retirement. So anybody that's 47 or below at the age of, as of the 1st of January this year, the new pension regime as it relates to the pension entitlement being 65 applies to those persons. So, but to your point, it is certainly the intention of that legislative change and that definitional change to ensure that people understand that, as you said, the employment is primarily a matter of contract law between employer and employee, but there is no legislated, mandated age of retirement from the government's perspective. So if people are able, willing, and that agreement is reached, they can work beyond 65, as is the case now. But it's the point about, given that the expectancy is that much higher, pension entitlement then should also reflect the fact that people are living longer, people are working longer, and it allows them to save that much more for when they do retire.
Well, I think that's an important point. There's some basic maths in here, isn't there, which is if the age at which the average person is going to live to is 83 and you retire at the age of 60, that's 23 years you're going to be living without potentially working, if that's the choice you make. Now, the basic maths one has to do is say, well, I'm going to be working for perhaps 40 years. I save 10% of my salary for 40 years, divide that then by 23. And that becomes quite a small number if you're not careful, unless there's been substantial investment growth. Now you're saying, well, actually, I'm going to work till 65, so the number of years you're contributing increases, the number of years you're drawing down decreases, and so the amount you get each year should hopefully be a much more substantial number, allowing people to live more comfortably in retirement, presumably. Absolutely,
and that is also tied to the increase in the year's maximum pensionable earnings from 60 to 87,000, both because it was actually recommended in one of the reports that we drew on heavily as a government. That's the Mercer report of 2007. So it's an inflation-adjusted figure that we decided upon, but also it's the complement to raising the pension entitlement age to also raising the year's maximum pension of earnings. And what that means is if you make up to $87,000 a year, you are pensionable on that full amount. Anything beyond $87,000 a year, you don't have to pay pensions, but there's nothing in the law that prevents you from making additional voluntary contributions. And then the additional voluntary contributions change is an important one because we want people to invest more in saving for their future. And so by changing it where you can actually access additional voluntary contributions in specific cases of need prior to reaching the age of pension entitlement, gives people the comfort to know that, yes, if I save for my retirement, but if I have a issue with education or issue with housing or issue with employment and or issue with health, I can then draw from my additional savings if and necessary. Currently, or as I said, before this provision came into force or comes into force, there is no option to be able to actually draw from your additional voluntary contributions. Whatever is there is locked. And that was acting as a disincentive in some instances for people to actually put aside more because they were concerned about, well, what if I need to access it prior to? So the government was cognizant of that and wants to encourage more savings for retirement. So by making that change to the additional voluntary contributions should hopefully change behavior in that regard. And that's something that was also recommended in the Mercer report.
Let me also add that I think we need to recognize as a country that our pension system is less than 20 years old. Well, you mentioned earlier, when you save for retirement, you're saving 30 and 40 years. And that's a key point, because if you only save what you have in your pension, you're not going to have enough. People need to be making additional contributions or saving in some other mechanism if they don't want to put it in their pension plan, so that they will have enough when it comes time to retirement.
And I think just adding to that point before we get back to the voluntary contribution, but I think the beauty of it being young, or the pension system here being young, is that it allows, government in conjunction with employees and employers to actually make the right decisions and allow it to grow in a way that is sustainable for the long term. I mean, we've seen, there's a significant amount of pension plans that are heavily underfunded across the world right now. So hopefully, we can learn and make decisions, and it's good to see some action taken by government. Just getting back to the voluntary contribution. So, I think that's great. If 60, if there's certain reasons you can now take it out. Let's take it to retirement now, and say someone's been adding in additional voluntary contributions. Do they have? What are their options as far as, they're now at retirement and they're getting money out? How much money are they taking out on a monthly basis or annually basis, and is there options for them to actually take out more, let's say, or take out the voluntary contribution and use that for another investment?
Well, when it comes to retirement, you really have two options of how to access your funds. You can either transfer the money held in your pension plan to an annuity, which is held by an insurance company, or you can transfer to a retirement savings arrangement, which basically is just a mechanism used to pay out the contributions to you or your benefit to you. We recently actually just undertook a very important project in which we reviewed the amount that is actually paid out on an annual basis. It was previously set at $12,000, and it was indexed slightly over a period of time. But what we've done now is we did a very detailed study with Morneau Shepell, which are consultants out of Canada. Mm-hmm. And we recognized that amount needed to be reviewed and evaluated to make it more appropriate for people. So with their assistance, we've determined that the new amount, which actually took effect on the 9th of January, so earlier this month, is $12,480. So that might sound like a minor change to some people, but under the old schedule, first of all, it would take you 3 years to get $12,480. And second of all, the old schedule did not consider your age in any way, did not consider your account value in any way. The new schedule allows for the minimum threshold, which is the $12,480. That's the new amount. Okay. That's going to then be adjusted for inflation. In addition, it establishes a minimum and a maximum percentage. So we have the $12,480 as the minimum threshold. Mm-hmm. So if you are a person who has a substantial amount of money in pensions, right, then you'll be able to access more of your money than the minimum threshold. That's the importance of a minimum and a maximum percentage.
Okay.
But if you're a person who doesn't necessarily have a substantial amount, then you know this is the minimum threshold, and then that threshold will increase with inflation. So I think that's a very important change that has been made. But going back to the question about accessing, so you can either access with annuity or with the RSA. So you have those two options. If when you get to retirement, you have made substantial additional voluntary contributions, mm-hmm. under the new structure, you'll be able to access them under the 4 criteria. If you haven't accessed them under that criteria, then you'll be able to take them out as a lump sum in retirement, which is how it is now.
Okay. We need to take a brief break. We've already gone through our first half of the show this morning. Please join us again in 2 minutes as we continue our conversation with Minister Rivers and Ms. Wollaston, Superintendent of Pensions, regarding the new changes to the pension legislation here on Ireland.
Money Sense, the only personal finance radio show in the Cayman Islands, hosted by Simon Caudry from the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
This is Money Sense.
Welcome back. In the second half of today's show, we are going to continue our conversation with Minister Rivers and Ms. Wollaston regarding the pension landscape here in Cayman. Now, in the first half of the show, we talked in some detail about things that have recently changed. I think it's probably quite useful to try and clarify the pension industry and the pension legislation is complicated, right? There's a lot of things associated with it. So perhaps you can just help us out by understanding what has not changed right now. And then we can talk a little bit more about what's imminent and what's going to change.
Okay, so I think again, because of the length of the show, the amount of changes that have been approved in the legislation, we will focus on of those changes that have been approved in the primary legislation, that is the amendment law of 2016, what has actually been included in the commencement order. So the dates that we know when certain provisions will in fact come into force. Okay. So at that point, I mean, with that in mind, I'm going to ask Amy to talk about some of the other provisions that we know that will be coming into force and when those provisions will be coming into force and what that impact is.
Okay.
Over to you, Amy.
No problem. So 2 key changes that will be coming. So in December of this year, December 31st of this year, actually, the ability to make an overseas transfer, the criteria for that will actually change. So under the present law, the only requirement to make an overseas transfer is that your employment is terminated. That's all that's required. Mm-hmm. However, in the amendment, which, as I said, comes into effect in December of 2017, the requirement for transfers will be extended. So in addition to the termination of employment, there must be no contributions to your account for 2 years, and you must cease to reside in the island for 2 years. So that's quite a different way than it is currently. I'll let Minister talk about the policy behind that.
That's an interesting one because it will affect a lot of people in different ways. People who previously were able to take their money overseas will now have to wait 2 years, if I understand you correctly. And so people, whether rightly or wrongly, will have questions about that. So perhaps you could just talk to us through the philosophical policy reasons why that change was introduced.
Again, I think it's because, especially given the nature of our economy, given the nature of our workforce being very transient, where people come and go, and they come and go often for various reasons, rollover, etc., we wanted to ensure that the purpose and the intended purpose of pensions is maintained, and that the fact is, if persons are planning to be more permanent members of the community, but for whatever reason takes the breaks, that there is some level of ability to do so. So the ability to transfer is still there, but it does now cause people to be more planning is going to be in required in order to make the determinations as to when, if I leave, am I leaving for good or am I leaving just for a break? So the issue and the reason why the commencement date is set a year out is to take into consideration that there are people that are working on island now who may be having those considerations, employers as well as employees. So it gives people time to plan. If they want to be a more permanent member of the community, they know that in a year's time, this is going to be the law of the land that will apply to everyone. But if you're here now, you came here for a finite period of time, a short period of time, or like I said, a finite period of time, you can then make the adjustments and the decisions within and the arrangements. Employers can make arrangements with respect to their recruitment practices and their recruitment policies, etc. So it does take into consideration a person's consideration currently, giving them that year to plan, so to speak. But it also then, going forward, takes into consideration the fact that pensions are for the intended purpose of being for pensions, and so you can transfer to another pension plan or analogous pension system overseas after the 2-year period once you decide that you've left the jurisdiction, and that is considered to be a reasonable time away.
Sure. Well, no one, if I understand it correctly, no one's actually prejudiced in essence by this, in the sense that someone who leaves the island will, after 2 years, have their pension pot transferred to a new pension provider somewhere else.
If they elect to do so, yes.
The detriment, in inverted commas, I use inverted commas around that, the detriment is that it has to stay on Cayman Islands pension provider. And if someone is unhappy with the performance of that, that's the negative potentially. If they perform well, that's the positive. But they're not forced. The money doesn't sit there in a non-interest bearing account for 2 years waiting for them to transfer. It still stays as part of the pension system, right?
That's correct. But let us also focus on the fact, and I didn't make this point when I started, the criteria I listed is only for an overseas transfer. So if you're unhappy with your current pension plan, then that's considered a local transfer, would not be subject to the criteria I listed, but then you can just exercise the option of moving from one pension plan to another.
Okay.
And
So
that option always exists.
And I guess let me just take a step back. Maybe this is a silly question, but if you have, under the current law as it stands right now, if you had someone here who'd contributed and then left Island, does the transfer have to go into another registered pension plan, or do they have the ability to take that cash directly?
Okay, so there's two different things, which is the next thing I was going to talk about.
Okay.
So that's a good segue. So there's two things. There's a transfer, which for clarity means that your entire balance, whatever that is basically moved from your current pension plan to another pension or an analogous product overseas.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to move into a retirement type product. It can't
Okay.
move into your savings account. That's a transfer. But a refund, which is a completely different thing. A refund means that you get your entire balance back in a lump sum to you personally, not to a pension plan, but to you personally. And that's the difference between the terms. I know some people get them confused, so I'm glad you brought that up so we could clarify that.
under what circumstances then is someone entitled to a refund?
Okay, so under the current law, as it is now, you would be able to get a refund when your employment is terminated, you've had no contributions to your account for 2 years, and you've ceased to reside on the island for 6 months. That's how it is now.
Mm-hmm.
So the amendment to the law, which actually comes into effect in December of 2019, with respect to refunds, will remove the ability to get a refund altogether. Yeah. That will not exist. In order to get a refund prior to then, you need to have ceased your contributions by December of 2017 of this year. That way, you would
meet the 2 year
meet
window.
the 2 year requirement that exists.
Why wait until December 2019 to eliminate the refund? Why not just eliminate that today?
For the same reason that I discussed from the transfer provision, we want to give people time to get their affairs in order to make whatever decisions they want to make long-term plans about where they want to be, resident, working, living, making their home, so to speak. So it's to give both employers and employees that ability to make those decisions in a reasonable period of time. So that's why a year was given. In essence, it comes into effect on 2019, but the contributions would have to stop by the end of this year, December 31st, meaning you would have to terminate your employment. So again, we didn't want to, as a government, be unreasonable and bring that change into force immediately without giving people that ability to make those plans that they may have for their life. The reason why we felt it was important to make the change at all is because this idea of a refund for pensions is very much an anomaly. It is not something that we are aware of that exists in any other pension jurisdiction. And what it does is it lessens the ability for potential abuses of the pension fund, in the sense that pension, going back to the primary purpose of pension, is to save for your retirement, save for when you're no longer in the workforce, hopefully by choice. And certainly it allows you then to be able to live comfortably as an income replacement. But this situation of a refund, there were a number of cases that the department has dealt with over the years that the spirit and the purpose and the essence of pensions were not being carried out because of that ability in the law.
And I've heard people who have said to me, well, I'm leaving the island. Why do you care as to what I do with my pension money, and if I take it all out and spend it on a yacht or spend it on a car? And it's true. The island, in that sense, shouldn't care if you leave the country, but it's an incredibly naive and short-sighted view of that person, because unless that person knows they're going to die at the age of 65, they're going to need some saving somewhere else in the future. So from a purely financial and economic perspective, everybody should be thinking, and it's very difficult to think about pensions because they're things that don't happen until you, well, hopefully a while away. although we all seem to be getting closer to that date, and it worries me a little bit as the grey hairs form. But it is something that people need to think about much more seriously, about the essence of what a pension is for. The idea that ever there would be a refund implies that you're never going to be a pensioner, which, of course, is almost improbable unless something catastrophic happens. So I think that's a very positive development. I recognise, I accept that 2 years you give people the chance to see the evolution of the law and change it, but I do think that's a very positive step.
Well, thank you. And I think just to your point about, again, from the kind of government perspective, and going back to the point I made about having a very transient work force where people often come and go for short breaks, even when you leave the jurisdiction, doesn't necessarily mean that you've left the jurisdiction, if you know what I mean. So we want to make sure that you are planning for, if you ever were to return to the jurisdiction, as you said, you hopefully don't experience a catastrophic situation and you're able to retire and experience your golden years. So that is some of the considerations that we had in mind as well. But certainly there are provisions in the law that allows for, if you once you reach the age of pension entitlement, and if you were to then move overseas or have been overseas at that point, and you want to access your pension funds, but there is no analogous pension system in the country that you're in, and you don't want to just receive the pension payments from the Cayman Islands directly, which is also an option to do, because even if you move wherever in the world, you can still get your pension payouts from whatever provider locally here in the Cayman Islands. But for whatever reason, if you decide at that point you've reached pension entitlement, you want the lump sum, that is possible under the change that we've made as well, because if there is no analogous pension system that you can get that money at that time, you are of pensionable age, it is your money, you definitely have the ability to then use it to live off of.
Sure. Well, we've got about 2 minutes left in the show, which is nowhere remotely close enough to dwell on this next topic, which I want to ask you about, but it's important to talk about, so let's just try and do it ever so briefly. Compliance. It's still an issue on Ireland, right? There are still companies which aren't paying pensions when they should be. How big an issue is it, and will the changes that the law is making make your life as superintendent, for instance, easier to make this problem smaller? So tell me about how this is going to make your life easier, or if it will. Well,
there are several changes in the legislation that will actually strengthen the legislation in order to deal with compliance. First of all, on February 1st, actually, there's a significant increase in the fines that exist in legislation. So, as we all know, the law came into effect in 1998. So basically in the past 19 years now, the law has not been amended. None of the fines have been changed. So we have increased all of the fines. Actually, we've introduced some new fines as well. So that then allows the judiciary to award or make awards in those issues more pertinent, more important. And then in addition to that, there's also the ability for departments to collaborate. So people criticize some departments for operating in silos. But this particular provision is meant to address that point, so that now our department will be able to collaborate with other departments like immigration, like trade and business, or Department of Commerce and Investment, in order to deal with issues of employers not actually doing what they should be doing under the legislation. Let me also point out that recently the Office of the Complaints Commissioner actually issued certification to the ministry that the department had complied with all of their requirements from the 2010 report. So I think that's a positive step for the department as well.
So if somebody
that verification by the Office of the Complaints Commissioner came as a result of the fact that the government made the changes to the legislation in order to strengthen the department, as well as just outlined.
Let me also touch on something else. It hasn't come yet, but it's things to come. The introduction of administrative fines. There are several other government departments who have that ability, and we're seeking to introduce that as well, which would allow for the department to more effectively and efficiently deal with issues of compliance. We don't necessarily have to go through the court process, which we recognize can be time-consuming. They have a heavy workload as well. This now creates another opportunity for us to better enforce the legislation.
And if somebody has a concern that they've not been treated fairly by the employer, they approach you and say, I've got a problem and you can help deal with it.
Absolutely.
Okay,
All
great.
they need to do is file the complaint with our office.
Great. Well, we are, I'm afraid, running out of time rapidly, so I'm afraid Thank you both for joining us this morning. It's
Thank
been
you.
a real pleasure,
Yeah.
Minister and Superintendent. So
Thank
thank
you.
you both
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Our pleasure. As a final note then, before we leave, I just want to remind all our listeners that today's show will be able to be heard as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage, and encourage you, if you have a question or conversation that you want to make about the show, please email us at moneysense@candw.ky or tweet us at moneysenseradio. With that, thank you once again, goodbye, and please do tune in 2 weeks' time.
Money Sense is brought to you with the support of OneTradeX. OneTradeX, the Cayman Islands' #1 choice for online brokerage.